connected during a difficult time, and we have made them publicly available. So since our founding in 1975 by a group of dedicated grassroots environmentalists, IEC has led issue advocacy campaigns by allowing environmental organizations to pool their resources and create a higher profile for environmental issues. So today, IEC represents more than 90 environmental and community organizations, nearly 400 individual members from throughout Illinois. If you're not already a member of IEC and are able to get it, please consider joining today by using the link that was just dropped in the chat box. So my name is Tonyisha Harris. I am the Illinois Clean Jobs Coalition Administrator, and I will be moderating today's panel, Illinois Youth talk about climate anxiety and reclaim their future. So before we get into the panel, there's a few housekeeping items I'd like to address. All attendees are muted by default. If you join via Zoom, please use the chat function to ask questions, comments, or provide resources. Those are always helpful. Time permitting, we will take questions at the end of the session. And for those joining by phone, you can use *9 to raise your hand. So we are hoping to save the last 15 minutes for Q&A and give you a chance to talk to the wonderful youth activists that we have on the panel right now. All right, so I'm going to start off by introducing everyone, then we'll get into the panel discussion. We have Xavier X. He is a member of the International Indigenous Youth Council Chicago chapter. This is a youth organization created by women and Two-Spirit youth as an effect of the Standing Rock Indigenous uprisings of 2016. He is a Tano artist and student attending Northeastern Illinois University studying environmental and justice studies, focusing on the continuation of Indigenous knowledge and narratives being spread at the front lines of social movement and youth development. He is devoted to empowerment through traditional Indigenous practices, community building, and restorative justice, and he serves as an after-school counselor at Metro Chicago YMCA and Chicago Public Schools. He is 23 years old. We also have Ella Berry. She is 17 years old and a rising senior at Bennett Academy. She is the logistics director for Illinois Youth Climate Movement and has helped to organize 3 climate strikes and multiple other actions with the organization. And last but not least, we have Claire Rychlewski. She is a writer, journalist, and activist born and raised in Chicago. She has been part of Sunrise Chicago for nearly 12 months and is working on the group's endorsement and policy team. She is 28 years old. All right, so I'd like to thank our panelists for being here. You guys can feel free to come off of mute. We're about to get started. So the first question I'd like to present is, we're living in a climate crisis right now. Some people also describe it as an existential crisis. And the youth climate movement has taken over a lot of activist actions in the media. There are a lot of young people from all ages. There's like a small elementary school, high school group that some members in the ICJC work with, spanning to college graduates and over. And you guys yourself are aged from 17 to 28. So, there's a lot of talk about the climate crisis and how it's affecting the younger generation. And I just want to know, how did you guys learn about the climate crisis? What was your first introduction to it?
I think for me, I always had known what it was and known that it existed. Just that had always been something that I knew. But I think that really when I first learned how bad it was and how much we needed to take action and how little action was actually being taken was probably about 2 years ago. So I was probably 15, and that's right before I got involved with the Illinois Youth Climate
Movement. Yeah, I think I never really learned about it through formal channels. So the climate crisis wasn't really discussed in school in any meaningful way. It was always referred to in this vague, opaque way as something that was happening but was inevitable. And I think it wasn't until maybe college when I started understanding through fossil fuel divestment movements on campus and reading texts about the climate crisis that it's something that's a systemic issue. It's not something solved by just recycling or beach cleanups. It's something it's a lot bigger than individual action, but will require a lot of individual work. So
yeah, for me, I kind of started learning about the climate crisis at a very young age. Through my schooling. It's funny because now elementary schools have to kind of implement all this climate crisis education into education. So I learned it as early as the 4th grade about where we were heading. And to me, and in my personal experience, it's just something that's inevitable, that the climate is constantly shifting. And I would definitely say that it's getting to the point where more people are becoming awakened to this happening, and we're ready to implement, so.
Yeah, and I like to just it seems like even though this is in a way a systemic issue and it's a problem everyone deals with, all of you have discussed that you found out about it at different stages of your life. Whether you always knew about it, you kind of learned about it in some arbitrary way, or as early as the 4th grade, which I'm really surprised. Personally, I learned about the climate crisis because I had an eccentric biology teacher who just taught my high school class environmental science instead of biology. So don't ask me any cell questions, but I can explain photosynthesis to you. And that's really important, especially how you said you learned about it in the 4th grade, because this is becoming a part of a curriculum for younger and younger people, which shows that it's really important to start educating people young. And you guys here as youth activists, you've clearly seen the importance of learning about this issue before most people would think that you should be bothered by it. So with however your introduction to the climate change and climate crisis it was, whatever age you were, whether it's taught well in school, when you did learn about it, what happened? Can you explain basically what we're all here for, what climate anxiety is and how it affects your everyday life? And I really think this is something that sets some generations apart, because the climate anxiety is a relatively new term that has been born out of the youth climate movement. So can you explain what that is for the people that are here and how it affects you?
I think for me, I said that I probably realized the extent of the climate crisis when I was around 15. And I think that's at first when I learned about it, it was climate anxiety, just feeling kind of where are we headed, and what is the point for my generation and for younger kids if we're just headed toward this future that is just pretty much doomed already. So that's why I got involved with the work that I do, because I think that doing something about it definitely does help to alleviate the climate anxiety, but it's still definitely there, this thought that's am I going to be able to do all these normal things that past generations have been able to do in my future?
Yeah, I think just echoing what Ella said, for me, one big piece of climate anxiety is this really overwhelming feeling of powerlessness and hopelessness. You have this axe hanging over your head, and we're seeing it play out, every winter, every summer with really extreme weather. We're seeing rising water levels, increasing occurrences of respiratory illnesses because of polluted air. So I think, once you sort of realize the magnitude of the crisis, there is this sort of feeling of powerlessness that sets in. But once you start taking action, once you find groups that are trying to implement change, I think that it grants a lot of autonomy. So that's been very helpful for me for alleviating, as being part of Sunrise and working with our partner groups.
Yeah, when we look into the depths of what climate anxiety is, it's kind of just our reaction to, our relatives, our world just being in this flux of change. And that's really what it stems out to be in terms of how it affects our everyday lives. To me, climate anxiety is not being completely sure if within the next 2 years we'll have fresh, clean drinking water that we don't have to pay for. To me, climate anxiety is more than just about the climate. It becomes more human in that sense, and it's kind of what we're experiencing today. Climate anxiety is being afraid to go outside and being afraid to interact with all our relations, and it's affecting our everyday lives in a very critical way.
Yeah, I think that fear and that distress and that feeling of helplessness is real and shared amongst a lot of young people of our generations. Climate anxiety is also sometimes called eco-anxiety, and it's the distress that's produced by environmental change impacting on people while they're directly connected to their home environment. And this has apparently become so prominent and important that the American Psychological Association created a 69-page climate guide to help mental health care providers figure out how to help their patients with it, because it's relatively new, but it's very prominent and potent. And it's especially for like young people, which you see on the panel, myself, I'm 22, and I'm also a youth activist. It is born from, well, I share a little of my story. I got my BS from Loyola, and environmental science was like every day learning about the doom and gloom of climate change, but we also have the solutions, but there's a lot of bureaucracy about why they aren't being used. And it's really hard to live with that because I think, Claire, as you were saying, it's like, think about things that generations before you are able to do that we may not be able to get to do. And I think that's really important to understand for anyone working with a youth activist or try to understand where the youth climate movement is coming from, that, you know, a lot of people in this movement carry that burden of climate anxiety or eco-anxiety, and it's not something that just goes away. And it is like having an axe over our head. You know, 10 years, I like to joke and say 10 years to live your best life. And that number will decrease as we go along. So, but even with that anxiety, you guys are all youth activists, and you clearly, something motivated you to become an activist, to fight back for climate, no matter how old you were. So can you explain, like, why even with that climate anxiety, why are you an activist? Like, why do you do what you do?
I think that the climate anxiety can actually be kind of like a driving force, because it's like, yes, like this could be coming, but there is something that we can do about it, and there is an opportunity for us to at least try and do what we can to stop it from happening. And I mean, we all have people that we love that are young, and I have like a little brother and all this, you know, everyone has someone that is going to grow up in this world. And so we need to do our best to take care of it. And even if that seems like a daunting task, it's still, for me at least, it makes me feel better to know that I am trying to do something about it.
Yeah, I feel the exact same way. And I also think when you think about climate injustice and the climate crisis, like that's a situation that just touches every other issue that a lot of activists are fighting for, whether that's like, you know, solving like inequities based on socioeconomic status or race, you know, access to healthcare. All of those fights that we're taking on are kind of encompassed in solving environmental injustice. So, and then like Ella was saying, I mean, it's just, it makes you feel a lot better to be doing something and to be taking some kind of action. So, yeah.
As an Indigenous youth, it's in my blood to resist. We've been resisting this climate, this threat against the climate for 500 years. And at the depths of it, you know, our Indigenous communities and our communities of color are the ones that are mostly affected by this climate crisis. We're the ones displaced out of our communities. We're the ones that become out of sync with our lands. And it's, to me, it's more than just activism. It's resisting colonialism, you know. It's something that's just drived in my blood.
Bex, can you explain more how it feels to you, or maybe some people you work with, to have that history of fighting back against colonialism and being displaced, and all the other struggles that, you know, Indigenous people and yourself work through? What's it like to have to, in a way, pick up that work that has been happening for 500 years?
So what I'm finding on the land that my family comes from, which is currently Puerto Rico, is that the land is extracting itself, you know. Currently, Puerto Rico has had the highest population of climate refugees in our current United States, and that's not even being looked at. The Caribbean islands were the first to get hit by colonialism, and to me, that it's no coincidence that the island is suffering the way it is with all the hurricanes and earthquakes that have been hitting. And there's a direct relation with colonialism, that history of violence, and this climate crisis. And it seems that we're living in times where the youth are realizing this, and the youth aren't just youth that are rising up, but it's the land that's rising up. We're part of the land that's rising up, and we can only wait to see what more there is to come, you know.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, and also everyone sharing your story, which can be really hard to do. But we're talking about climate anxiety, and that personal peace and connection is always important to have. So thank you for sharing. And so when we discussed what climate anxiety is, how you guys got involved, but how do people react when you express climate anxiety or like any hesitation? So kind of going back to a hesitation to like commit to big things, like, you know, young people are delaying starting families, getting married, buying homes. And some of that has to do with climate anxiety and just thinking that there won't be a need to do any of this if the planet is going to be uninhabitable really soon. So when you like express your climate anxiety, and maybe that's an explanation for why you've decided to not do X, Y, or Z, how do people react when you share that?
I mean, I think it definitely depends on who you're talking to, but for the large majority of people, it's something that they haven't had to experience if you're talking to someone that's not necessarily in our generation. So it's something that they don't really understand, I think. And so it can feel like it's not really a real thing to them, I think, because they don't have this fear, because they have like lived their lives and they have had all these experiences already. So I think that it's not necessarily that they don't believe it, but I think it's just that they can't possibly understand because they won't have to deal with it.
Yeah, I think it's definitely depending on who you're talking to, but yeah, folks who are not in our generation, or it's really hard for them to conceptualize what this means for us as younger folks who didn't necessarily cause this crisis, but are dealing with the fallout of it. And yeah, I think sometimes I'm met with like either, you know, hesitation or skepticism around like what people see as like big demands, like asking for a Green New Deal or legislation that takes this crisis as seriously as it should be taken. Because I think a lot of people can't imagine that shift in the status quo, but I think we've seen that that's possible and you know, a viable solution. So.
Well, what I find is that a lot of people kind of react in a fearful way. And to me, that fear stems from their kind of uncomfortability with changing, you know, with changing from what we're so comfortable in, living in a capitalistic way that extracts so much from our land. And it's something very critical to understand, because it seems to me that it's become a fear tactic, that people have become afraid of the environment, you know, afraid of what it can possibly do to us. But yet we're not looking inside of ourselves in the way that we're consuming things constantly from the environment, that it's having those reactions. And to me, it seems that the world, we need to be more in better relations to, you know, be able to face this climate crisis without any fear and express and have these dialogues and discussions of climate anxiety together so we can find those solutions.
Yeah, Matt, the way we talk about climate and people's relationships to nature can be divisive or inclusive. There's a lot of different terms to describe, Mother Nature and Mother Earth. Some ethnicities, nationalities have a more complex relationship to the land than others might. And it can be really hard to articulate that to someone who hasn't had to live that experience or live that background. And then for, younger people may not need to handle it, kind of inheriting a problem that we didn't help contribute to, as someone expressed earlier. So with that resistance or skepticism of what you're feeling, how do you use your voice and time to combat the climate crisis? And I'd especially like to hear your thoughts on this, because I am, a lot of people with the Illinois Youth Climate, the youth climate movement cannot vote. They're not old enough to vote, and part of that is relying on the relationships you build with voters, people who can vote, convincing them to vote for climate policy. So how do you use your voice and time to combat the climate crisis? And I especially like to know from you, as someone who is not old enough to vote yet.
Yeah, so like Tonyisha said, I'm 17, so I cannot vote yet. I will not be able to vote this year, which is frustrating. But I think for me, when it comes to the voting issue, it's about, if I can't vote, then I will find a different way to say what I am feeling and trying to push this movement forward. And so I work with the Illinois Youth Climate Movement. We've organized 5 climate strikes, I believe. I've helped with 3 of those. And our goal when we have those actions, and we have other actions as well, our goal is to put pressure on politicians to say people do care. And just because maybe I can't vote, and a lot of people that I work with and who attend these actions can't vote, but we care, and we will be able to vote eventually. And so pay attention to us now, because when we can vote, then we will know you did not listen to us, so we do not support you. You are not putting the future of your constituents in the forefront of your policy, and we will know that when we do reach the age where we can vote.
Yeah, I mean, I can vote, but a lot of members of our hub in Sunrise are, high school students who aren't able to vote yet. And we've done a lot of things both within and outside of the existing governmental bureaucracies. So like last summer, we sat in at the Democratic Party of Illinois' office to demand that the DNC back a climate debate. In September, we were, part of that September 20th climate strike, which was one of the largest, I think the largest youth-led demonstration in history. It was amazing to see, high school students, grade school students were taking time off of school to come and make their voices heard. And then in the fall, Sunrise had our endorsements process, when we heard from and endorsed some progressive Democratic candidates for Congress and for state, Senate, and House of Representatives. They were running against incumbents who we felt hadn't done enough to prioritize the climate crisis. And, we helped elect Marie Newman to nomination, as well as State Senator Robert Peters. So I think there are so many ways that we can be affecting change that don't have to do with going to the polls. Obviously, I encourage voting, but there's so much work that can be done beyond that, that can bring in a lot of younger folks or folks who are not able to vote for immigration reasons or anything else. So.
Yeah. The International Indigenous Youth Council has been using their voice and body since 2016 to combat this climate crisis against, the main oppressor, which is the state, back in Standing Rock against the Dakota Access Pipelines. And that continues on today in our movement and the ways that we utilize our leadership as youth of color in these climate spaces. We support our communities. We're down on the front lines, suffering with our communities. We invest in organizations that are on the front lines. You know, there's a great organization, the Amazon Frontlines, which is helping Indigenous communities down there in the Amazon fight against those oil companies, fight against those animal agricultural companies. And that's where the solutions are. You know, our solutions are held within our voices as people of color, as Indigenous peoples that suffer directly from this climate crisis, directly from, you know, all of these trickling effects of capitalism and imperialism. And we just use our voice to shed light and pinpoint the voices in our communities.
Yeah, I think youth of color have an especially powerful voice to play in a movement that for a very long time has been very exclusionary of any people of color. So I love seeing other youth of color out there striking or phone banking or lobbying, employing different tactics that they can to get their voices heard. And so with all the things that each of your respective organizations do, and especially with how young some of the activists and participants can be, you know, the climate strikes were met with a wide ranging of opinions, from the media being praised for it. I know in Illinois, Governor Pritzker responded to the tweets of the climate strikes that happened in September, which is a really amazing feat, but also some people are being mocked for it and saying, oh, students are just looking for reasons to skip school, or you shouldn't encourage this type of behavior, being said like you're too young to deal with this. So when you get that type of visceral reaction or maybe praise, like how do you handle it? How does your organization handle it, and how do you find the inspiration to continue moving forward? Because some of it can be really hard to hear.
Yeah, definitely. The Illinois Youth Climate Movement, we have a lot of our youngest member, like for our core team, is in 8th grade, and our oldest is a senior in high school. So we are definitely on the younger end of this movement. And we have a lot of even elementary school students that attend our strikes. And like Tonyisha was saying, on September 20th, we organized that strike, and that got a lot of media attention, and there was some negative stuff. There was definitely, especially on Twitter, we got a lot of negative, like, oh, you're just doing this to skip school. You just, you don't really care. You just don't want to go to school. And we try not to respond to that most of the time. But every once in a while we do. And it's usually we just respond with like humor. We're just like, this is how we are trying to do our best, and you don't have to agree with us, and you don't have to believe that we really are being genuine, but we are. So there's nothing that we can do to change your mind. So we try to not let that get under our skin too much. But when it comes to the positive praise, it always feels good, for someone to say like, thank you for what you're doing. But when it comes from the media, a lot of the time it feels a little ingenuine, because they will say, one day, oh, they'll put stories out about us, and we appreciate the media attention, but also we all know and remember that the media is not helping this movement as much as it can be, and that they are definitely hurting the environment in a lot of ways. So we do appreciate getting our word out there as much as possible, but we try to take all of the response with a grain of salt.
Yeah, I mean, I think not going to school to strike for environmental justice is a completely worthy cause. So I can't understand why anybody would mock that decision. I'm really like blown away by the young people who have made that sacrifice. School is out right now because we're dealing with a global pandemic, the likes of which we'll see again, because climate change is causing some of that stuff to happen. So I think it's all about perspective. But yeah, I think both the negative and the positive feedback from members of the media or from people who are a little bit older can be should definitely be taken with a grain of salt. And I think sometimes the positive feedback can be frustrating because, you know, it's always nice to hear that people appreciate the work that we're doing, but I think folks can do more than say, you know, your generation makes me hopeful. I think there's work that, you know, older and younger people can do together. So yeah, I guess that would be my response.
Yeah, we react wherever our community needs us. So the backlash we get, we just make sure we're staying true to what our community needs, and we kind of act upon that.
Yeah, the reactions can be very wide-ranging, and I'm very curious to hear this from you guys. Take it with just a grain of salt. That would be one of the ways to muster through it. I know personally one of the worst comments that I hated to hear was youth activists are so radical. I don't see what's radical about fighting for our planet to be around a little longer than 10 years and, you know, clean air and water. I don't think that's radical, and I also don't think being called an inspiration is helpful because, you know, there's a lot of people who can or can't vote. There's a lot of people who can't commit to this work, and being an inspiration doesn't stop greenhouse gas emissions. So I also feel that but I also know the youth climate movement is shaping the way people talk about climate change, and making sure that, at least to some aspect, I feel like politicians know they need to have a climate platform if they're going to get votes, whether you're able to vote or not. So with that in mind, how is the youth climate movement different from environmental movements in the past? And what would you say is the greatest strength that your organization brings to the table?
I think the biggest difference is that like, we appreciate the work that every climate movement has done in the past, and they have definitely built up to the work that we do now. But I think that it's different because we are kind of the last generation that is going to be able to really fight for this and really make change. Like, we all know, like, the 10-year mark. So that kind of falls heavily on our generation to do something about. And so I think that brings a sense of urgency to our work and a sense of, like, we have to get this done now. Like, we're not going to just sit around and wait for this anymore. We are going to make sure that this gets done. And I think that the Illinois Youth Climate Movement in particular brings a lot of strengths to the table in that we work with very young students. Like I said, we have 8th graders in our organization, and we have lots of elementary school students that come to our strikes. And I think that provides an opportunity for us to educate them. We had, on September 20th, we had a couple of schools that brought field trips to the strike that were elementary schools. And we thought that was awesome because it is a protest, obviously, but it also is an opportunity for us to educate and to tell these kids, like, yes, this is happening, but you have a voice, and you can make change, and you can do your best to make sure that your voice gets heard. So I think that we have been trying to focus on that a lot.
Yeah, I think in years past, fighting for the environment was framed as people fighting for their future, but it really is about people fighting for their present. I mean, this is impacting us right now. And I think that understanding underlies a lot of the youth-led movements today. I also think a lot of environmental movements in the past failed to build multi-race, multi-class coalitions to combat environmental injustice. You know, you have to understand that climate injustice touches all corners of life. If you're in a marginalized, low-income community where the air is clogged by pollutants from factories that were built in those neighborhoods because of the disregard for the citizens who occupy them, that's going to yield a whole host of problems that directly impact someone's daily life right now, economically, socially. You know, if you don't have access to clean water, that's something that's happening to you right now, and that touches more than just, you know, something that feels a little like nebulous, like the entire environment. And sometimes I hear pushback from people saying, like, you know, people can't focus on you know, fighting climate injustice, disarming fossil fuel companies because they have more immediate issues like paying their rent. But when you broaden your movement to be inclusive of all narratives, you begin to understand the intersections. And I think that's why legislation like a Green New Deal is so significant, because it's more than a climate bill. It guarantees jobs, it guarantees high quality healthcare, affordable housing, access to clean water and air, quality training. So that's been Sunrise's real focus, and partnering with groups like, you know, Good Kids Med City and the International Indigenous Youth Council, like, you know, groups that encompass the entire spectrum of folks fighting for climate justice.
Yeah, similar to what Claire said, I think the main difference of the current environmental movement or the youth climate movement is that it's intersectional, and that it not only touches on climate justice, but also social justice in that sense. And what we're bringing to the table that is really stretching this movement afar is just women leadership, and especially people of color leadership at that. You know, I think one of our main threats against the environment is patriarchy, and it's this patriarchal society. You know, so bringing more women to the front table is definitely what's helping our movement rise with the environment. You know, we know that our women know about creation, our women know about love, and I think that is a huge impact to this movement, as well as the experiences of our Black and brown youth that are speaking up against the climate in their experiences, and then tying that all together with social justice. You know, I think that's the main difference of what the youth climate movement is looking like now, that the movements of the past never had.
I think, X, you just gave a great cue for all the women and people of color in the chat to give themselves a pat on the back, being considered leaders. So thank you for that. And Claire, I think I love the way you had framed it, like the environmental movements in the past have been fighting for your future, and right now we're fighting for our present. I think that's a great way to express what it feels like and how the youth climate movement differs, because the consequences of climate change are happening now and they're affecting us now. And the tipping point is going to happen within our generation. We're going to see it. So thank you for sharing that. We have a lot of questions in the chat. Very happy. People are very eager to talk to you. So we are going to start the Q&A portion. And for people on the phone, you can press *9 to raise your hand, and we will unmute you so you can share your questions. And also, at any moment throughout this, feel free to drop your question or comment or resources in the chat box. But I am going to go through them. So from Cynthia, she asks, for any speaker, how do you convince others successfully that everyday crises that exist, floods, poor drinking water, poor air quality, are indeed connected with the climate crisis? So how do you make those connections to people?
I think it can definitely be difficult. I go to school at a very conservative, in a very conservative suburb. And so it's hard for me to talk to my peers a lot of the time, because they like to say, you know, like this is just what happens. Like the climate changes sometimes. We've seen this in the past, you know, and I'm sure that many of you have heard that argument too. And I mean, they're not wrong. The climate has changed in the past, and things like this do happen, but not to this extent that we're seeing. And there is, I mean, just too much scientific evidence to ignore. And so I think that sometimes it depends on how the conversation is going, but I think that sometimes when people bring up that point of, you know, how do you know that this is connected? Sometimes it can be just sort of like a bait question, like they know the answer and they just refuse to like hear it. But I think that if they are genuinely trying to hear what you have to say, then I think that just pointing out that, yes, things like this have happened in the past, but not to this extent, and not this many. Like we've seen so many freak weather incidents in the past few years, and those are not just a coincidence. So I think that just pointing out the evidence backs that this is not just a coincidence.
Yeah, I would agree. I think pointing to the extreme weather is a great way to demonstrate the evidence of the climate crisis and how it's impacting us right now. I think that's been one of the strongest talking points for me. Yeah.
May you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, so how do you convince others that everyday crises like poor drinking water, poor water quality is connected with the climate crisis?
To me, it's kind of like a lack of information, you know, for people to not to have to be convinced. And with that, we really need to focus in on where our education is kind of failing us in terms of why people aren't aware of the climate crises that happen around us and have been happening around us for the past, 200, 300 years since this industrial revolution, and it really just takes kind of a sincere act of storytelling to, shift one mind at a time. And if we want to convince people, or if we have to convince people, we should have these stories to share. We should have our own experiences to share. And I truly believe that our experiences are valid enough.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned storytelling. I also love to use that tactic. I think when you can make the connection to something within people's community or add a human face to it, they understand a little more. So thank you. Beth Holland wanted to add a comment. Just say, while you still can't vote, you are a constituent with a voice that your political leaders represent and listen to you. So thank you for sharing that. I think this next question would be really great for Claire. So Rachel would like to hear thoughts about young, youth, and adult partnerships, and what are the best ways for adults to support your work. And I think Sunrise Chicago has very wide range of the ages that are in it. We have, as you were saying, young people as young as elementary and high school to older adults in your organization. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on youth-adult partnerships, and then we can open it up to the rest of the panelists.
Yeah, so that's correct. Yeah, I think the ages and people who have been involved in our work and our actions really range. I think that the most important touchstone is just, employing active listening to what young people, millennials and Gen Z people are experiencing, what their demands are, and how their experiences have been different from yours as somebody who might be a bit older. And then just investing time and resources into groups like, the ones that are speaking today. I don't think that there needs to be this barrier based on age. Everybody is going to experience the climate crisis. So no matter how young or old, it's just a matter of time. If we have 10 years, a lot of folks of various ages are going to be experiencing this. So I think listening and allowing young folks to take leadership while supporting that effort would be my suggestion.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for that. And then, I know Illinois Youth Climate Movement, that's something you can age out of. I think, once they're 18 or no longer a high school student, you just can't be part of the organization anymore. So, what does it mean for you guys, where your cap is 18, to have a youth adult partnership?
Yeah, so we do have members up through college. We do basically middle school through college for our members. And I think that it's, when you do an age out, we actually haven't had anyone that's aged out yet because we've only been around for a few years, but we will have some this year. And it's just knowing that you are still part of our group, and we still, even if you have never been an actual member of our organization, we still want you to come to our actions, and we still want you to be involved, just because you can't necessarily be in the group. We have a lot of adults that come to our climate strikes, and we appreciate everyone who's there. We want everyone to come regardless of age, regardless of anything. And so I think that definitely knowing just we still do want you to participate, just because necessarily you can't be like in a leadership role in our organization. We still definitely want you to come to our actions and to help us out. And also, I think touching off what Claire said, I think that it's important to listen to youth voices and to understand that we have different experiences than you, and you probably won't understand everything that we have experienced in relation to the climate crisis, but just listening and trying your best to understand what we're going through and allowing us to lead is the best way to be an ally to this, I think.
Thank you. And X, how does your organization, what would your advice be for youth adult partnerships?
Mm-hmm. So the biggest foundation between so the biggest foundation that's connecting our youth to our adult and even to our elders is the basic respect, right? We've always had respect for our elders, and we constantly are looking to them for guidance and vice versa, because they are just another version of us. It's to be in right relation with one another, and we have found that works for our community. So
Yeah, so we heard active listening, showing up to actions, and mutual respect on both sides as a way to help foster young youth and adult partnership. Speaking of relationship building, how do you go about building a multiracial and multicultural coalition? And how can adults do this locally, for example, or through whatever level that they'd like?
I think in my experience with the Illinois Youth Climate Movement, we work a lot with groups like Good Kids Med City, and we work with the International Indigenous Youth Council a lot. So trying to bring in voices, and I think that it's important to make an active effort to bring in multiracial voices, and you can't just expect like that to naturally happen. You have to make an effort for it. And yeah, I think that just making sure that you partner with groups that are focused on multiracial issues. And I think that just like I said, you have to be active, and you can't just expect it to happen. So I think that just making sure that you are trying to find other voices and to listen to those other voices and to work with them.
Yeah, I think at Sunrise we focus a lot on our strong partnerships with the groups that Ella mentioned, and then also Little Village Environmental Justice Organization, LVAO, which is, focused on striving for environmental justice for immigrant and low-income and working-class families. I think being aware of what other groups are doing, one group cannot do everything, so that's why partnering is so significant. Being really knowledgeable of how groups that represent different voices are attacking some of these problems, and then sort of following their lead, I think is really significant. And then also within your own movements, championing people of color and women and people who represent different groups and different walks of life. So yeah, I think just being aware of what groups are doing in your city, and figuring out ways to partner with those groups.
And the IYC is constantly involved in coalitions that are of that nature. And one of the biggest things that we experience is just being tokenized. And I think what it takes to have successful coalitions is for members to be able to be accountable to themselves and be comfortable with passing the mic to the others that deserve it the most, for whatever the message may be. And I think that is truly what will build successful coalitions. Most of the coalitions of the past have become coalitions that dismembered for XY reasons, you know, and I truly believe for us to find better solutions is through coalitions and is through the act of accountability and kind of letting others speak when the time is right.
Yeah, sharing the resources, the attention, and providing a platform for groups that may not have it already. I think those are great ways to build a strong and diverse coalition. So moving on, shifting to a green and clean economy can still produce profits while respecting the environment and move us away from extracting from the earth, kind of like Xavier had mentioned. How do we build a voice that's stronger than the fossil fuel industry and bring real change while also growing the green sector?
I think that we actually have a really unique opportunity right now with the COVID-19 pandemic that we're living through. I was looking at, I don't know, 2 weeks ago maybe, there was a huge drop in the oil markets, and obviously that was brought on by this pandemic, which obviously is not a good thing, but I think that we can try our best to bring something good out of it. So I think that we can try to highlight the uses of green energy now, because we have an opportunity to bring more of that in right now. And I also think that when it comes to building our voice, I think it's important to, this is like what X said, I think it's important to tell our stories, and I think that like telling human stories is more powerful than, the corporations or whoever else. So I think that it's just really important to tell our stories.
Yeah, I think it goes back to harnessing and lifting up voices that haven't been previously heard from. I think that goes a long way in building that kind of movement. I also agree that the COVID-19 pandemic has kind of shown us that rapid change and response is very possible if we want it. So I think continuing to push along those lines, that the asks that we have are not too daunting and not too large. And yeah, I mean, I think also there's a lot to be said for job opportunities within a green economy and a green infrastructure.
We have to push our communities and organize our communities to be more sovereign in terms of their food, in terms of the way we function. A lot of our climate solutions should be in the hands of the community, and I know that is that is a big factor that is halting our growth right now as our separate communities, because we're constantly having corporations build within our communities without the consultation of the community, and that's harmful. That is violent.
So we've got a lot of questions coming in. 3 left. I'm going to try and get to all of them. It's 6 minutes. I believe that we can do it. So what are the local and state level policy changes your groups are calling for in Illinois?
Right now, I know Illinois Environmental Council as well, we're really pushing for CEJA, the Clean Energy Jobs Act. So I'm sure a lot of you know what that is, but it brings a lot of clean energy jobs, obviously, to our state. And also, we were really focused on having a climate emergency declared in the city of Chicago, and along with many other amazing organizations, we were able to accomplish that goal. So that was something that we were really excited about. So that's right now we're really focused on CEJA, I think.
Yeah, I'm going to echo what Ella said. CEJA is a huge part of our policy push, and that's been a big focus for our policy team, which is still in the nascent stages. Obviously, right now, we're also trying to push for COVID recovery legislation. We're part of the Right to Recovery Coalition, and we believe that this is sort of a microcosm of what we're going to experience when things continue to get worse with respect to the environment. And then we're also part of a coalition called Democratize ComEd, which is a move to municipalize our energy supply here in Chicago, make it a public utility instead of owned by a private company. which would give us, as citizens, a seat at the table in terms of decarbonizing our energy sector here in Chicago, and would just also, go a long way in terms of rate payments and preventing shutoffs for vulnerable communities. So we're trying to champion a lot of different policies that we believe encompass all of the impacts of climate injustice.
The International Indigenous Youth Council calls for Indigenous sovereignty and land back.
Thanks. So what relationships, this will be our last question also, there's some resources being dropped in the chat right now, but what relationships exist or have been contemplated with mainstream educational institutions like the Chicago Teachers Union, local school councils, and various faculties? So like, does anyone on this panel have any relationships with them? Have they been helpful?
We do not have any like formal connections with any educational institutions, but we have had in the past at our strikes, we've had the Chicago Teachers Union and various schools, especially Loyola University in Chicago, have sent huge groups of students to our strikes. So I don't know, I don't think they were necessarily supported by the school itself, but just they had put together, the students themselves had put together a large group of students. But we have had very successful relationships with things like the Field Museum and the Shedd Aquarium, which are not necessarily educational institutions, but they help to educate the youth here in Chicago. And so we have really appreciated support from those organizations in the past.
Yeah, I don't think we have necessarily formal relationships at this point. I know some of our coalition partners are like members of graduate student unions in Chicago. And we, I think, have had relationships with both high schools and colleges in terms of like recruiting hub members and potentially hiring like paid summer interns for Sunrise Chicago, which is huge. So, but I would be interested to see more from like CTU and other local school councils. I think that would be a great bridge to gap for sure.
As far as our community goes, we do have teachers that work for CPS that interact with us within the community, and we also have professors from different universities, and we gain a lot from being able to teach to share community with each other.
All right, thank you for that. We are going to end it here as we're approaching 1 o'clock. Thank you for joining IEC for our Lunch and Learn series. We hope these sessions will help keep our community informed in this full time. These are recorded, so you can find each session, including this one's, on IEC's YouTube and our website. And also, if you're not already a member of IEC and are able to give, please consider donating, but also consider looking up all of these wonderful panelist organizations and donating to them or joining them as well, spreading the word about the wonderful things they do. They have been instrumental to the movement. I know IEC and the ICJC values our partnerships with them. I love working with everyone here, and hopefully we'll see you again next time. So thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.